Hi, welcome to the Itihasa channel. Today I talk to you about the Nishada prince Ekalavya. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Nagendraya Namaha, Om Amme Narayana, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Ganeshaya Namaha, Om Anjanaya Namaha, Om Subramanyaya Namaha, Swamiye Sharnamayyapo, Om Guruve Namaha. So over the first few months after Drona's Gurukula ashrama was opened up, news spread far and wide about the greatness of this great ashrama. This great Gurukula was offering the highest level of education in every form and every field. Of course, the art of war was supervised by Drona himself, but various other fields of information and knowledge were being imparted there. Astronomy, astrology, astrophysics, chemistry, metallurgy, biology and medicine, and including diverse fields like mathematics and advanced mathematics. Every field, the Vedas, the Shastras, everything was being offered in this Gurukula of Drona. And not just Kshatriyas, not just the Kuru princes. Brahmana children from various places started coming to this ashrama, and kings friendly to the Hastinapur kingdom requested Bhishma if they could send their children to learn from the great Drona, and Bhishma agreed. And as time progressed, the Gurukula swelled and Drona's heart swelled with pride. A few months down the line after the ashrama and Gurukula was started, one day Drona was sitting on his seat, observing the Kuru princes, both the Kauravas and the Pandavas, in their various forms of war, archery, sword fighting, mace fighting, riding the chariot, riding horses, riding elephants, and carrying out various activities. And Drona sat on his seat with a keen eye observing everybody, looking for mistakes. And once in a while, he would shout out to his assistants and tell them, get this thing corrected. And Drona had a large number of assistants to help him. And so one day when Drona was sitting on his seat, he noticed a movement right at the corner of his eye. And he looked towards it and noticed a young dark boy coming towards the ashrama, a little scared, furtively glancing around, looking for the slightest sounds, smelling the air for smells that were familiar and foreign, and being able to take all these senses in and perceive what is going on around him. He looked scared, like an animal cornered, but looking at him, Drona realized that this was no ordinary boy. If cornered, this boy would lash out and would kill to get away. Such was the agility with which he was coming. He looked like a panther. And he slowly came into the Gurukula and looked, and his eyes rested on Drona, and a smile came on his face, and he ran towards Drona and held Drona's feet. And as Drona looked down at the boy holding on to his feet, he could feel those coarse palms holding on to the feet with a vice-like grip. And Drona realized that this was no ordinary boy, this was no ordinary grip. If he had held on tight to that foot, it would be very difficult to let go from that vice-like grip. And Drona knew what he was looking at. And as suddenly as he held Drona's foot, he let go, held his hands in prayer in front of Drona and bowed down and said, "Salutations, O Guru." And Drona stood up and looked at him and smiled. And Drona asked him, "Who are you? Pray tell me." And he said, "I am Ekalavya. I am the son of the king of the Nishadas, the tribes which rule the forest. My father is Hiranyadanush. And I have come here to learn from you, for I wish to learn archery with the longbow. I wish to be familiarized with the longbow and be the greatest archer in all the land." And Drona looked at him from top to bottom. He was black as the night, eyes gleaming like the eyes of a panther. And Drona knew that he could look into the dark and he could see as clearly as we see in the daytime. His body was taut and muscular. He had the broad shoulders of an archer. And Drona knew one look at him that this boy had a killer instinct. A killer instinct groomed in the jungle. And he thought, this boy would be difficult to tame. If he would come and stay and learn with the princes, there's bound to be trouble. One of the arrogant princes could let out a loose comment, and this boy would lash out, probably lash out with a knife, injuring someone, and that would be a complication in Drona's ashrama that he didn't want. He knew this boy was no ordinary boy. He was meant for success. He was meant for greatness. And then Drona closed his eyes, looked at him and told him, my child, in this ashrama, I mainly teach the princes, the Kshatriya princes, the sons of kings, and I'm not allowed to treat other people of other varnas. And it will not be possible for me to take you as a student. The eyes of the boy immediately got downcast and a sorrow clouded his face. And Drona felt sad. But then he smiled back again, grinning and showing sharp teeth that were probably used to tearing out meat that was not fully cooked. And his muscles glistened in the sun, and he looked at Drona and said, but master, my teacher, my acharya, if you bless me, then I shall go and learn for myself with your blessings and with your guidance. And then Drona closed his eyes, smiled back, put his hand on the head of this young Nishada boy, his wavy hair touching his hand. Guru Drona blessed him and said, my blessings are with you, my child. And as the words came out of his mouth, he knew that he had set something in play and that destiny would anyway take its path. And something was going to come out of this boy, but he didn't know what. And this boy looked back at him and smiled and ran away back to where he came from. As Drona saw this young Nishada prince, the panther, running back into the wild, he closed his eyes and knew that he's going to see this boy one day, and he dreaded to know when. Many people say that Drona discriminated against the poor tribal boy when he refused to take him on as a student. Discrimination against the tribals didn't exist 5,000 to 7,000 years ago at the time of the Mahabharata. Discrimination against the tribals came in recently, and their subsequent scheduling to protect them. These are all recent phenomena. Drona refused this Nishada prince for two reasons. He knew that this boy was a difficult boy to handle, was a difficult boy to tame. That boy of the jungle still had the jungle in him, still had the forest in him. He was like a wild animal. He would not get along well with the arrogant Kshatriya princes around him, and it was only a matter of time before somebody would insult him and this boy would lash out. And that would be a problem Drona didn't want to have on his hands. The other reason being that Drona knew that this boy was no ordinary boy. And if trained like how Drona would train the others, he may well be equal to the Kshatriya princes, for he may surpass most of them. And how would it look when Bhishma would come down and ask him on the progress, and he would have to admit that one Nishada jungle prince was better than all the other Kshatriyas? Drona knew which side his bread was buttered. And for Drona, the only important person in his life was Drona. Nobody else mattered. For Drona, he knew that if this Nishada boy, this Nishada prince were to continue training in his ashrama, that bread might get a little less buttered, have a little less jam on it eventually. So Ekalavya ran into the forest from where he came. He ran into the forest with glee, having been blessed by his Guru Drona. He passed thick wooded forests, large shrubs of bamboo with thorns so pointed that it could shred your skin if you were not careful. He passed through beautiful flowers and beautiful meadows. Some of these flowers were carnivorous and would damage your skin and would kill you if you would ingest them. And finally, after passing through these thick jungles, he came to a clearing which looked like paradise. There was a lotus pond in the middle of this clearing with the most beautiful lotuses of different hues. At the edge of the pond stood a tree, a large Ashwatha tree, a peepal tree. Along with this tree, entwined around it, were three other trees that grew with the support of this large Ashwatha tree. And this young boy, having reached his training ground, which will be his training ground for the next many years, got down to work immediately. From the banks of the lotus pond, he started collecting clumps of soft clay. And then, taking this clay to the base of this large Ashwatha tree, he decided to recreate his guru. He started with the feet that he had held on tight when he first went to see the guru. And he started sculpting the feet of his guru with utmost devotion. He would recreate every single vein that stood out from his guru's foot, from his guru's feet. And once he created it, he touched his head down to the feet to take its blessings. Then he started working his way up the large muscular legs. Like I told you, these rishis never skip leg day. And so he worked his way with the clay up the large muscular legs and the thighs, ensuring that he could recreate every single muscle that he saw on his guru's thighs. Then he came to the groin that was covered by the white loincloth. Drona always wore a loincloth, tightly set against his groin. It was easy to run with the loincloth, jump onto galloping horses and fight. For all the silks and wonderful garments that Bhishma had gifted Drona, all that he always wore for the next 10, 12 years of training was just a white loincloth. And then he came to the torso. The tight abdominals, well-defined muscles, and the broad shoulders, and the sacred thread running across it. He reconstructed all this out of memory for having seen his Acharya for just a few minutes. And taking the clay slowly, one by one, he started getting on to the arms. The left arm hanging down on the side of the body and the right arm raised in blessing. The fingers of the left arm coming down almost till the knee. For it was the mark of an archer that an archer would have extremely broad shoulders and long arms, as did Drona have, as did this young boy Ekalavya have, and as did every great archer of the land of the day. For it was said that when an archer would string a long bow and pull it taut, and it has been said in the Mahabharata in various places, that when a great archer, a Maharathi, would pull the long bow taut, the bow and the bowstring would form a circle. That would be the level to which the bow would be pulled. And this entire span that the bow would be pulled would be more than 3 cubits. A cubit is the length from the tip of the finger to the elbow. So it would be around 1.5 feet. And so when a long bow would be pulled to its ultimate length, the length of the arrow that would sit in would be a little longer than 1.5 meters, almost 2 meters. And so the arrow that would be fitted into a long bow at its maximum pull should be around 2 meters in length. And the pull of that great archer would be a little more than 1.5 meters. And so he drew that Guru Dronacharya with his hands, with his left hand hanging down on the side, the tip of the finger almost reaching the knee. Then he started with the neck and the face. The face took a long time to sculpt, for he wanted to get every crease and every marking on the face perfect, up to perfection. And those lines come from those years of poverty on the face of Drona, were reproduced in absolute precision by Ekalavya. He would take up a bit of clay, line the face up, and then he would not be happy. He would take his knife and carve it off, and over time, he got the face absolutely right, and the eyes took a little longer too. Those piercing, penetrating eyes that looked into your soul, he got that absolutely perfect. And then the jata on the head. And happy, he looked at this great sculpture that he had sculpted over the last few days, got out a few lotuses from the lotus pond, made a garland out of it, and garlanded his guru. He had to stand on a bit of a bench to be able to reach the guru's neck to garland him. And then, placing a lotus at the feet of his guru, he touched his head to the guru's feet and started his training. This entire sculpture took a few days to prepare. He had worked fervently over the last few days. When he felt hungry, he would eat a bit of the lotus stalk, or he would hunt down a boar and cook it in a pit and have its meat. And in time, that once the sculpture was ready, Ekalavya decided to make his own bow and his arrows. He went to the bamboo shrubs and took out the best young bamboo sapling. Stripping it down, he made strips of it and mixed it with another stronger wood. And then, using the local vine from the surrounding forest, he bound the two woods together, the bamboo and the other wood, strapping up a fine long bow, a bow that was quite heavy to hold, but a bow that could bend without snapping. And then he started fashioning out long arrows as sharp and as straight as ever. And having filled his quiver, he carved out wooden birds, effortlessly climbed trees around the clearing. Perching these wooden birds over all the trees around, he started shooting at them, developing his technique. And so it went on for many years. In the meantime, 10 years had passed. In the ashrama, the princes were in deep training, learning all the skills that were available for them. And at one time, after 10 years, the princes decided to go hunting with the permission of their guru. So they made many batches and went out in batches to different corners to go hunt in the jungles surrounding the ashrama. One such batch consisted of Arjuna, Bhima, Nakula, Sahadeva, and a few of the Kaurava princes. They, along with their horses, started going towards the deep forest, accompanied by their helpers and their hunting dogs. It was a cacophony as they went hunting, quite unlike the hunting that Shantanu used to do in the years gone by. As we recall, Shantanu would go on his own, smelling the air for the smells of the beasts, and silently tracking them down and hunting them with his sword. These boys were young. They were around between 20 to 25 years of age now. And they would go hunting in groups, talking to each other, sending the hunting dogs ahead, and the dogs, barking as loudly as possible, would go after a scent and then find that the scent was a blind lead, and then go after another scent, and these boys would go hunting behind these hunting dogs. And there came to a point where one of the hunting dogs got a scent and started barking wildly and started running. It ran so fast and hard that it broke loose from the helper's hand and rushed into a thicket. And these boys started following through, hearing, and they could hear the barking of the hunting dog much in the distance. And suddenly, as they were running behind, the dog went silent. And these princes quietened down to listen to what was on the other side of the thick bushes. They couldn't hear the dog anymore. Arjuna signaled to Bhima that probably there was a wild animal ahead, which had pounced on the dog and killed it. Slowly, as they started inching their way forward, a strange sight greeted them. The dog ran back to them, and the dog's mouth was filled with 7 arrows tightly fitted into the mouth, and the dog was whimpering in agony. Arjuna and the other Kaurava princes and the Pandava princes stared at this dog in shock. Immediately, Arjuna realized what had happened. He got down to his dog and held it in his arms. He noted that 7 arrows were tightly fitted into the mouth of the dog. There was no blood coming out, but these arrows were tightly fitted. It had gone in deep enough to be able to lodge itself deep into the throat of this dog, but not deep enough to cut flesh and draw blood. What kind of wizardry was this? What kind of archery was this? And this idea was not lost on the Kaurava princes either. And Bhima was shocked. He asked, has our Guru Dronacharya come into the jungle somewhere? Has he discharged these arrows? And as Arjuna started pulling out the arrows from the dog's mouth, his hands started shaking in anxiety. For he realized that these arrows have been shot all at one time. All 7 arrows at once. In that one bark of a dog, when the dog opened its mouth to give a single bark, these 7 arrows were shot into the mouth. They were shot in with such precision that it went in and lodged itself right into the throat of the dog. Not shot hard enough that it would pierce flesh, but shot hard enough that it would lodge itself tightly and it wouldn't fall off. For if they were not shot during that one bark, that dog would have turned away and closed its mouth, and then it would have been difficult to shoot the next few arrows. This was no ordinary archery, and when Arjuna realized this, his hands trembled. They looked at each other and decided to go forth and investigate. Who was this master? Who was this Gandharva? Who was this Deva? Who was this divine being on the other side of this forest, of these thick bushes, who had discharged the arrows in such a beautiful manner? And Arjuna hoped it was no human. And Arjuna hoped that it was a Gandharva who had done this. The hunt had stopped being a hunt. It had now become an investigation. Holding down their arrows, they started walking into the thick bushes and presently came to a clearing where a strange sight greeted them. Standing in front of Arjuna was a tall, dark man, as black as the night, looking like a panther. He stood with his feet apart. His left hand had a bow, a long bow, and the right had an arrow. And he looked towards them and smiled. And Arjuna knew the moment he saw this man that if he as much as showed a flicker of movement towards his quiver, this man would have that arrow deep into Arjuna before he could even reach an arrow. And holding his right hand up, Arjuna greeted him and asked him, "Pray tell me, who are you?" And he said, "I am Ekalavya. I am a Nishada prince and my father is Hiranyadanush. He is the king of the Nishadas and we rule the jungle here." And then Arjuna looked at him and asked him, "Why did you injure our dog?" And Ekalavya looked at him back and said, "I didn't injure your dog. He was barking at me and disturbing me and irritating me. So I shot a few arrows into his mouth to keep him quiet. And if you observe him closely, he is not injured. I have not drawn blood." And Arjuna realized that this boy knew his own ability. And he asked him, "Who has taught you this archery? Who has taught you this?" And then he looked around to below the Ashwatha tree where his guru stood, the clay statue of Dronacharya. He looked at the statue and said, "This is my master, this is my teacher, this is my acharya. Whatever I know today of archery, I have learned from my Guru Dronacharya." And Arjuna was flabbergasted. He stood with his mouth open. A rush of emotions came into him, and he ran away from the clearing back to his horse, which was tethered at the entrance to the forest, and rode at breakneck speed back to the ashrama to his Guru Dronacharya. The other Pandava brothers and the few Kaurav brothers who had come as a team were quite flabbergasted at Arjuna's reaction and were awkwardly standing around, and they made small talk with Ekalavya for a few minutes and then took his leave and went back to the Gurukula, chasing Arjuna. Arjuna by then had reached Dronacharya and stood in front of him. When Dronacharya looked at Arjuna, he looked pale and he looked absolutely almost faint, and Dronacharya knew something was wrong. This was not the vibrant Arjuna he knew. And he asked him what happened. And Arjuna looked at Dronacharya and said, "You promised me, O Acharya, you promised me. You promised me that I would be the greatest archer of all the land. And there is one who you have trained who is better than me. How could you, O Acharya? How could you?" And he fell silent. And Dronacharya closed his eyes, for he knew that there could be no other answer that could be got out of Arjuna, for Arjuna was not in a state of mind to talk anymore. And then Dronacharya closed his eyes to think back. Who had he trained before he had come to Hastinapur, who had become so great that even the great Arjuna was shocked and stood in front of him in this state? A state that was scaring Dronacharya. And even though he thought back as far back as he couldn't think of even a single archer who could match Arjuna, who he had trained before he came to Hastinapur. And shortly the other princes arrived in the ashram and came to Drona, paid their respects to him, and then started to describe what they had seen. The Kaurava princes in excitement, for today they had seen the feat of an archer who was better than Arjuna, who was always the greatest in this Gurukula, and finally they had found an archer who was better than Arjuna himself. So they told the whole story to Dronacharya and described in detail of what they saw. And Dronacharya realized what had made Arjuna so nervous. And he told Arjuna, "Take me back to that man. Take me back to that jungle prince. I want to meet him. Get the chariot ready." And they summoned a chariot, and Drona and Arjuna got on. The other princes started to come and follow behind on their horses, but Drona stopped them and said, "No. This is a journey only Arjuna and I shall take. Nobody shall follow us." And they started riding back to the jungle, Arjuna and Drona on the chariot at a breakneck pace. There was silence in the chariot while they rode. Arjuna was silent, for he was ashamed at what he had seen, for he knew today that he was no match for the archer standing in the jungle. That black panther-like boy was way ahead of Arjuna in skills of archery, and Dronacharya was silent. He knew what he had to do, for he knew which side his bread was buttered, and there could be no archer who could be greater than the prince's training in his ashrama. And with a mind that was absolutely focused on the task he had ahead, Dronacharya went with Arjuna into the forest. They kept their chariot a little away, for they couldn't take the chariot into the dense jungle. And Arjuna, with his uncanny sense of geography and direction, took Dronacharya exactly to where they had gone to meet the great Ekalavya earlier in the day. It was evening time, and as they reached near, Dronacharya signaled to Arjuna that they should be silent. And stealthily they crept forward, for they didn't want to startle the Nishada prince. And as Dronacharya and Arjuna stealthily peered through the bushes, the clearing came into view, and a strange sight came to them. There, standing at the banks of the lotus pond, stood Ekalavya, the Nishada prince, almost like a panther. He stood with his feet apart in the mandala posture, one of the postures that gives you a sturdy base in archery. In his left hand was the long bow, and on his right was the arrow which was fixed to the string. The bow was pulled halfway across, and what surprised them was the blindfold he had tied across his eyes. He stood there in absolute peace, like he was meditating. And as Dronacharya looked at him, he knew that this was the calm look of an archer who would never miss. His entire body was in absolute peace and calm. His muscles were all relaxed, and Drona knew he had a slow breathing going on, a breath that was just one for every minute that passed. And as he stood in the mandala posture with the bow and arrow on his hand, partly drawn, he swiveled on his hip, a swivel that was almost 360 degrees. And as he swiveled, with his eyes blindfolded, he was listening. He was listening to the birds that were coming back in the evening, which had brought their worms home and were discussing with their loved ones of all the great hunts for the worms they had done on the day. And as he swiveled, he took note of the various positions of the different birds on the different trees around that clearing. And then Drona saw something that amazed him. Within a blink of an eye, this boy had taken out, one after the other in sequence, 8 arrows from his quiver, which was tied to his waist, and had shot 8 arrows in various directions by just swiveling his hip. The only muscles that were acting were the upper back. Every other muscle was absolutely relaxed. There was no change in his breathing through these 8 arrows that he had sent in the various directions. And then he took a crescent-shaped arrow and shot it towards the lotus pond. This crescent-shaped arrow bounced on the waters of the pond, cleanly slicing a lotus, and then came back to him with the arrow and the lotus, dropping both at his feet. He then shot another crescent-shaped arrow deep into the pond, and this time the arrow bounced out of the river with a beautiful fish at its tip, and both the arrow and the fish came and settled at the foot of this great archer. And then, keeping his bow down, he took forth his blindfold and looked around. And as he saw around, he saw dropping down 8 birds at 8 different points with an arrow gone through them. And he smiled to himself. And this is when Drona coughed, cleared his throat to let the archer know that he was around. The archer was tense again. Ekalavya looked around in the direction of the cough. And as Drona came out, his eyes lit up. Did he really believe his eyes? Was this his Acharya who had finally come to see him? And with extreme pleasure on his face, he ran to his Acharya and held his feet. And Drona remembered that vice-like grip on his foot that he had felt 10 years back, when that young wisp of a boy had come to him asking to be trained. Today this boy was tall and well-built with broad shoulders and long arms. This boy, as black as the night, was a little shorter than Arjuna and absolutely muscular. And Drona could see that killer instinct back again in those gleaming eyes. And Ekalavya took Drona to the sculpture of his guru that he had prepared, and Drona stared at the absolute likeliness of himself. The sculpture had aged a little with the wind and the rain. Drona had aged much less, for Drona was quite young and youthful, even though well in his advanced years. And then Drona looked at this boy. A stern look came over him, for he realized that this boy was an excellent archer, with no equal in all the land. And he looked at him and said, "So how have you been training all these years? Under whose guidance?" And this boy looked at his Acharya and said, "Under your guidance, Acharya. After I got your blessings have been with me all along, and it was with your blessings that I have gained mastery in archery." And Drona's face became tense and taut. He knew what he had to do, and he had been afraid that he would have to finally do it. The time had come. He didn't look at Arjuna. In fact, through all this, neither did Drona look at Arjuna, nor did Ekalavya even realize Arjuna was around. for all his adulation and admiration was for his Acharya. Arjuna was but a shadow on the side, inconsequential shadow. And Drona looked at this boy and told him, "My child, you have learnt archery from me, and it's time that you give your guru his guru-dakshina." And this boy smiled, for he said, "If my guru has asked for guru-dakshina, it means that he truly takes me to be his pupil, and there can be no greater honor for me. Ask for my life, Acharya, and I will give it to you gladly, for there is nothing greater for me today than my own guru asking me for guru-dakshina." And Dronacharya's face remained taut and strained. He looked down at this boy who knelt in front of him with his hands folded in prayer, with a gleam in his eyes for having seen his guru like he saw his God. And he looked down at this boy and said, "I would like to have my guru-dakshina now. I want your right thumb, for that shall be my guru-dakshina." And the smile not leaving his face, the gleam not leaving his face, this boy picked up the same crescent-shaped arrow that had brought the lotus from the lotus pond, took the sharp crescent-shaped arrow, and with one swipe cut off his thumb. He then took the bleeding thumb and placed it at the foot of his guru. Without a wince, without a whimper, the smile still set on his face, that gleam still in the eyes, and then touched his head to his guru's feet. He then held the stump that was cut off from his hand and held it down so that the blood would stop flowing out, and still stared at his guru's face with a smile on his face. Arjuna couldn't believe what he saw and was in a daze. And Drona knew that he would never be the same man again, for he had done something that was unforgivable, that even his ancestors would not forgive him. He looked down at the boy, touched his hand to his head, blessed him one last time, and walked away, his face gaunt and tears streaming down his face. Arjuna ran behind him in absolute shock. They walked in silence to the chariot and then rode back to the ashrama in absolute silence. Not a word was spoken between Acharya and Shishya, for today they had signed a bond in blood, a bond with the blood of Ekalavya. And the relationship between Dronacharya and Arjuna would never be the same. Not a word was spoken about this incident by either of them. It would remain with them to the grave. It was only Ekalavya who over time would disclose these events to his friends and people who asked him of why he would shoot without his thumb. And Ekalavya over time still blossomed into an excellent archer, an excellent warrior. He was not as good as he was without the use of his right thumb, and he had to learn to fight, to learn to use the bow and the arrow with the other hand now. And even then, he was never able to gain the proficiency in archery that he had before he had cut his thumb off. Over the years, Ekalavya took over the rulership of his land from his father Hiranyadanush when his father passed away. And then Ekalavya became the king of the Nishadas. In time, he gave his allegiance to the king Jarasandha of Magadha, the great Magadha empire, and became a close ally of King Jarasandha. And he would go with Jarasandha for all the times when Jarasandha would go to war. Ekalavya and his Nishada army would be there by their side. Indomitable and unbeatable, Ekalavya still a great archer. And incidentally, when Yudhishthira was performing the Rajasuya Yajna, kings from all over the land had come, kings who had agreed to take Yudhishthira as their emperor. Kings from all over the land had come to that Rajasuya Yajna. One among them was King Ekalavya of the Nishadas. And he had accepted Yudhishthira as the king of kings. And he had brought with him a wooden sandal laced with gold as a gift to King Yudhishthira at that time. Ekalavya couldn't forgive Krishna for having instigated Bhima to kill Jarasandha. And at one point of time, much later, Ekalavya had taken his Nishada army to Dwaraka to attack Dwaraka to subdue Krishna and to kill him. And it was during one of these wars that Krishna had come out personally to fight with this army of Vrishnis, the dreaded Vrishni soldiers. Krishna had come out to fight against Ekalavya and had killed him with a mace. And so died Ekalavya. This great Nishada prince would never be an archer as great as he was that day, for he didn't have his thumb. He was a far greater archer than most people of Bharatvarsha, even without his thumb. But at one time, the Lord Krishna had admitted to the Pandavas that Ekalavya had the capacity of being an archer comparable to Purushottama Rama himself. The great Purushottama Rama, who was an avatar of Narayana, Ekalavya was as great an archer as Rama himself. Ekalavya's son finally fought on the side of the Kauravas in the great Mahabharata war. And so Ekalavya attained moksha for having been killed by Lord Krishna himself. This is the story of the Nishada prince Ekalavya, who had to pay a blood price for having learnt under the sculpture of Drona, not the real Drona himself, but who willingly gave it as guru-dakshina for his teacher. And Drona would forever bear the weight of this sin. But for Drona, only one man mattered, and that was Drona. And Ekalavya had to pay the price for this. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Nagendraya Namaha. Om Amme Narayana. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ganeshaya Namaha. Om Anjanaya Namaha. Swami Sharanamayyappo. Om Kartikaya Namaha. Om Guruve Namaha.